Hello, welcome to our webinar today on our new report, which we released about 10 days ago, Election Imperatives, 10 recommendations for increasing college student voting and improving political learning and engagement in democracy in higher education. I'm Nancy Thomas, and I direct the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education. We're located at Tisch College at Tufts University. Tisch College is an unusual structure because our dean sits at the same table with other deans, such as the Arts and Sciences Dean and the Medical School Dean, and that gives us a broader reach on college campuses than a lot of centers, for example, for civic engagement. Our institute was formed in 2015, but many of you might know us for the voting study, National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement, which was actually launched in 2013. The institute does 5 different buckets of research, if you will. One is we do study college student voting, which I'll talk about in a minute. We also have a very deep involvement in studying campus climates for political learning and engagement in democracy. We study political equity and discourse and classroom teaching for democracy, pedagogy, and teaching methods. As I mentioned, we do run the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement, and I suppose many of you know us for that. It is a very large study. Campuses opt in, and at this point, nearly 1,200 colleges and universities nationally have decided to join the study. That gives us a wonderful database to work with. We have almost 10 million college students per election year, and we have data for the 2012, 2014, and 2016 elections. In addition to doing research on the database, we also provide each campus with a tailored, individualized report telling them their students' voting rates. And the image to the right side of this slide is an example of one of the pages that you would see in your report. What's also very compelling right now is, as we come up on a 2018 midterm election, you should know that the voting rates on college campuses were 18% in 2014. That includes graduate students who are older and therefore tend to vote more, and undergraduates. If we were to isolate the typical undergraduate age of 18 to 24 years old, only 13% of the 10 million college students in our study turned out to vote. So if you are aspiring for a particular number, such as 50% or something along those lines, you have a long way to go in all likelihood. And if you're wondering how to explain this to students, have them look around the room, take a look for 10 other people, and just say barely more than 1 in 10 are going to vote if 2014 rates hold. But of course, that's the hope, is that they won't. Our campus climate research, which I also mentioned, is very interesting and very relevant to the Election Imperatives report, which is why I'm going to mention it. We used the NSOLVE data to identify campuses that were voting at significantly higher or lower rates than we predicted based on a model that we put together. And based on that, we visited 9 of those campuses. 7 were positive outliers and 2 were negative outliers. When we visited those campuses, we ran focus groups and interviews, and eventually, over the course of the 9 campuses, worked with almost 500 people. Our findings were really striking because there were such common features to the campuses that were high outliers, that had striking high voting rates. And what was also striking is that the negative outliers were almost the reverse of that. When we analyzed the data, we came up with what we call Politics 365, which I think most of you or many of you have probably seen. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because we've written it up and we can obviously make that available to you. But these 5 elements of a politically engaged campus were significant drivers in the election imperatives document. So this is the document that we put out. As I said, it contains 10 recommendations, but I think it might be useful for you to know what's unusual about this report. What is really unusual is that it connects disconnected learning goals. For example, political learning is often relegated to a particular discipline. We're recommending political learning across the curriculum. We're also recommending particular content areas, such as the history and current state of civil rights and how to vote. So we want all students to engage in some level of political learning. The other dot that we're connecting, if you will, is better discussion. This was our #1 finding from the qualitative research, that political discussions across every nook and cranny of a campus make a difference. And so we think better discussion should be a focus. Diversity and inclusion is often identified as a goal for colleges and universities, and yet it isn't often connected with voting, political learning, better discussion, or even conversations about speech or academic freedom. Student activism is another important feature of highly engaged campuses. And then, of course, voting. So what we're trying to make the case for is using this 2018 election season to launch activities under these other 4 bullets, and of course voting, but do it in ways that connect these often disconnected learning goals. All right, let's take a little bit of time to talk about how this report is organized. As you can see from the report itself, there is a summary page. That is 2 pages. It's, I think, on pages 3 and 4. Let me just check that. Actually, it's 5 and 6 of the report. This is in here in such a way that you can isolate it and print it out if you just want to share the summary page. For each of the for each recommendation, we have a sort of a statement, and then we've got some brief notes on what that should be. Then what happens is, after pages 3 and actually 5 and 7, after pages 5 and 7, we get to the recommendations themselves, and we have a page for each one. So, for example, there is the recommendation that people reflect on past elections and reimagine 2018, and then you'll find a full page on it. For each recommendation, we also identify who should be primarily responsible for ensuring that this happens. Now, we did this because we've heard from a lot of people who are on the front lines of voter engagement work, particularly community engagement professionals and students, often student affairs, that they don't feel that the institutional leaders are adequately supporting their work. And so for that reason, we've really focused on what high-level administrators need to do, at least in the first few recommendations in the report. And then for each recommendation, we have a narrative that identifies lots of links and resources. So we tell you, for example, how you can come across various videos. We have at the bottom of the page for each one lots of resources that are not all from our shop, although some of them are. For example, on this particular one, we are recommending that you consider going to Circle's Reaching All Youth Strengthens Engagement Index, which is called the RAISE Index. That's just an example, but there are many, many resources that are beyond what IDHE has produced. We also have a toolkit for 2018, and all of the resources are in there. And if you have resources that you would like us to add to the 2018 toolkit, feel free to send it to us and we will put it under the appropriate recommendation. So I mentioned that these are addressed to senior institutional leaders, but one of the things that you might be wondering is, well, if I'm not a senior institutional leader, how do I reach them? And what we're recommending is that you take this report and send it to them, that you stress that the report is evidence-based. In other words, it's based on research on what counts in political, both voting and political climates on campus, and that we are recommending that senior administrators get involved. We are also very happy to talk to people on your campus if that would help you make the case. I should also mention that at the beginning of the report is a Dear Colleagues letter. It's on page 4, and it provides you with some rationale for why this matters. You could take that rationale and use it as you communicate with others on your campus. All right, so let's take a look at some of these things. You're going to see these little hanging apples. That means we think these are low-hanging fruit. In other words, things that are relatively easy to do. At one point, I went through the slide deck and I stamped important on a lot of them, but it was pointed out to me that they're all important recommendations, and maybe I shouldn't single out those that I think are more important than others, but I'll try to do that as we go through this. All right, so as you may recall, this is addressed to senior administrators, and so we want them to convene. We want them to take a look at their NSOLVE reports. We give you information on how to get involved in NSOLVE if you have not, if you're not a part of NSOLVE. We think that this is low-hanging fruit. Reading the reports is not that difficult to do, and it helps them identify pockets of engagement and disengagement. We're asking senior administrators to reflect on past elections. And in the longer page on this particular recommendation is a link to a blog post that contains election reflections. And then finally, administrators can set the tone. You know, presidents, they welcome students back to campus. They might welcome the new students. They might have a convocation. This is an opportunity to set the tone about what matters at this campus, whether it matters that people are engaged in democracy building in this country, or even global efforts to advance democratic principles and practices. One of the things that we have been asked about is how can we do this without alienating the non-citizens, the students who cannot vote, such as the international students or the undocumented students. We think that this is a perfect opportunity for presidents to set the tone that political learning and engagement are everybody's business. You do not need to be a voting citizen in order to have a stake in what is the outcome of a presidential election, or even just the issues behind the election. All right, we recommend that you remove the barriers to student voting. And again, this is a recommendation that goes to the senior administration because the presidents should use the power of the presidency to identify and remove technical barriers to voting that might be caused by statutory conditions such as the requirements on IDs or the placement of polling locations or how easy or hard it is to register voters. There are some great resources for people if they need some support. Fair Elections Legal Network, the ACLU, the League of Women Voters, and the Brennan Center all provide support on removing these technical barriers to voting. We recommend that campuses support online registration. There is, of course, TurboVote, which you probably know about. Many states have online registration. And then the Andrew Goodman Foundation has also come up with a system for online registration that you can find on our website. And finally, you've got to remove the non-statutory barriers to voting. So what are those? Those are the barriers that local voting officials may put in place that make it difficult. So for example, maybe they are not happy when they receive registration forms, or they're worried about a rush on the polling places on election day if you have one day voting. The thing to do there is to work with those local officials and try to help them if they need administrative support. Educating students to be poll workers, for example, might be one way to provide support so that you can remove the non-statutory barriers to voting. If they are more difficult, such as a local official trying to restrict voting for partisan reasons, that's when you might want to go get some help from some of the legal organizations. Number 3, develop informed voters. So we want campuses to do teach-ins and courses and forums and modules to teach both the history and the current state of voting rights in this country. One really nice way to do that is to follow the Supreme Court, and in this report, we've given you some resources for doing that. We've also given you some resources for helping students distinguish between facts and fake facts. And we think that's critically important. Nobody should graduate from college without knowing how to distinguish fake news from the real thing. Teach students how to vote. This is critically important. I think a lot of educators assume that when college students arrive, they've already been dragged to the polling places by their parents when they were younger, and that's just simply not the case. We recommend that you purchase or rent voting machines, and as you can see from the one pictured to the right here, that may not look at all like the one that you used. So one thing you can do is create a video that demonstrates how to use the machine, but in some places we know of campuses that have put a polling machine up in the student union and staffed it with people who can help explain the process to newcomers. Help students learn where their right to vote might make the biggest difference, and there are also some resources on that in the election imperatives document. Number 4, establish a permanent and inclusive coalition to improve the climate for political learning and participation. So this is interesting because a lot of you have coalitions. And yet those coalitions are often student coalitions. They're usually episodic and linked to an election season. We're talking about something quite different. We are asking colleges and universities to establish permanent and inclusive coalitions that are not focused on voting. Instead, they're focused on these other aims of election imperatives: political learning, inclusion, student agency and leadership, and then participation in democracy. We really want students to develop the knowledge and skills that they need to be keepers of democratic principles and practices, and we're hoping that that will be the charge of this coalition. Maintain the coalition beyond the election. Once again, this particular recommendation is addressed to senior administrators, and particularly the academic affairs officer. Number 5, invest in the right kind of training. I suppose right should have been in parentheses here, because what does that mean? Well, we are recommending that coalition members, students, staff, anybody who's working on election activities on behalf of the institution, learn to either engage in or facilitate politically charged dialogues. And on our website is a very lengthy document. It is a training manual for training people to facilitate political conversations. This manual has everything you need in it. It's got a mock agenda, it's got exercises, it's got instructions on how to run the exercises. It's very user friendly. I have yet to find a campus that does not have trained facilitators right there who can run this workshop. It's about a day and a half long workshop that could be spread out over time. But if you do not have such people on your campus, then call us. We can come there and run this workshop for you. If you want to get a group of campuses together, we can come and do that as well. Finally, and this is related to political discussions, rethink how people are approached. So let's say, for example, you've set up registration tables, and it is typical for students to staff those tables, and then they will call out to people walking by, hey, have you registered to vote? Why don't you come on over here and I'll help you? Well, what would happen if it were a different conversation? What would happen if it were, what issues are concerning you right now? How can you get involved? And then use the best practices in active listening so that people can feel like their voices are heard. This is a great place to change the paradigm and getting away from telling everybody to asking everybody questions. We think that's low-hanging fruit. Number 6, talk politics across campus. So we recommend a lot of conversations about issues. Going back to the question, how can we engage non-citizens, people who are unable to vote yet are on campus as students? How can we engage them in the process? Well, they care about issues too. They care about social conflicts. So talk about your NSOLVE data, but also talk about policy questions and social conflicts. Use the elections as an opportunity to increase and improve the discussion skills of the people participating in those conversations. I'm going to skip the one and come back to it on shared responsibility and just say that this is also a good opportunity to cultivate a cadre of trained facilitators and some structures for campus-wide discussions. If you do that, then if you have some kind of campus crisis, and sadly there are no campuses out there that are immune to campus crises, you'll have a group of trained facilitators who are ready to lead conversations that are campus-wide, large volume conversations. So then I want to go back to this norms of shared responsibility. You know, I think that if I could wave a magic wand and I could make all campuses do one thing, it would be that they put into their credo or their honor code or their written materials about student conduct or their ground rules for conversations in the classroom or the way they set up ground rules for other issue discussions, that they would add to that list and emphasize shared responsibility. I think that in this country, what we have lost, at least at the federal level and among our policy makers, is a sense of shared responsibility for the health and future of democracy. And I think that if we start educating our students so that when they graduate, they understand that concept, it will go a long way toward reforming some of the systems in this country that are simply not working. And finally, I think you can talk about the tensions around free speech and inclusion. Once again, we have a discussion guide that we have produced on that topic. You can download it and run with it. I've combined number 7 and 8 because they have a different audience. The people responsible there are faculty, maybe the chief academic affairs officer. Obviously, others should be involved in this, but in terms of really saying, okay, who's going to be responsible for making these things happen? Faculty and the chief academic affairs officers are the ones who are responsible. So we're recommending that classroom discussions be encouraged across the curriculum. Right now, we're working on a really interesting project with faculty members over in our engineering school who teach first year students, embedding policy conversations and difficult dialogues across the first year experience in engineering classes. We also recommend supporting faculty development efforts in the arts of discussion-based teaching and how to manage a classroom conflict. What should go in the syllabus? What kinds of things should a professor do on the first day of class to build trust, to build relationships in the classroom, and to create a learning community that shares responsibility for each other's success? So that I think is an important thing, faculty development. One of the overlooked structures on campuses are these disciplinary clubs, like the ones with logos to the right here. These are opportunities for faculty and students to get together outside of the classroom and to discuss important issues, particularly policy questions. So it's an ideal setting. One of the questions that we get all the time is, how do we engage commuters? How do we engage students who are coming from long distances or who have a job or two and family responsibilities? How do we engage them in these important conversations when their lives are very, very busy? And one way to do that is through these disciplinary clubs, because one thing about commuter students that we learned in our qualitative research is that they relish their relationships with their professors. They want to spend time with them. They want to develop a rapport with them. They need recommendations from them. And so these disciplinary clubs are ideal opportunities to get those students involved with faculty. Obviously, the classroom is also ideal, but if you're looking for beyond the classroom experiences, well, that's what we're recommending. Finally, there's this concept out there called nudging. You know, imagine somebody just kind of elbowing you as a reminder. Well, why don't you ask faculty to nudge students? And by that, I mean for 2 weeks prior to registration deadlines, if you've got them, ask faculty to just say to students, don't forget to register. Now, I don't think that took me 3 seconds. We're not talking about overhauling their class time. We are just asking them to nudge. 3 seconds. Please register. Don't forget to register. The other thing that they should be doing is making sure that students remember that voting day is coming up and that they need a plan to vote. What sometimes happens with students is they get to 10 minutes of 8 and they say, oh, I've got to go vote, and yet they haven't figured out, where do I go? What do I have to do? So faculty members can nudge and say, don't forget to plan to vote. Don't forget to plan to vote. Now, some of you may be thinking, yeah, great, this is terrific, Nancy, I love your idea, but how am I going to get faculty to do that? And I think that's a really valid question, and kind of like the question, how do I get my president or my provost to pay attention to this stuff too? I think the answer is the same that I gave earlier. You've got to send them this report. Draw from the letter for some compelling language, use your own language, um, make presentations at faculty senates, go talk to department chairs and deans. This is really an exercise in community organizing. And so we'll get to this in a minute, but these are leadership challenges for people doing this work, and I think you just have to tackle them that way. Again, you can always call us and bring us in if that helps. I've also combined 9 and 10 because they both involve students. So one has to do with student activism and leadership, which I just mentioned. One of the things that we found on the campuses that we visited is, at least the high outlier campuses, is that they are pretty nimble and responsive to student activism. On one campus, I was actually scheduled to interview the president, and at that exact moment, a protest erupted outside involving the termination of a professor. The students had heard the rumors that the professor was being terminated. Word got around, and a protest erupted because they didn't want that professor to be terminated. The president told me, "Sorry, our meeting is over," went downstairs and talked with the students for about 2 hours. And one of the first things the president did was listen to what they were talking about, what were their concerns. Well, it turned out that they weren't as concerned about the termination of this particular professor as they were about the lack of transparency about the processes of hiring and firing. And so the president said, well, why don't we work together so that we can make those processes more transparent? I cannot share with you personnel matters. I cannot tell you why this particular person was terminated. That is a violation of their privacy rights and the law regarding treatment of employees. But I think we can come up with a way to share the process so that everybody is comfortable with it. So this president was encouraging, nimble, responsive, and solved a problem. And what did that president do? Kicked it back to the students. This was something that we saw often, is turning problems back to students and say, help us come up with a solution, or you come up with a solution, which then leads me to the next point, which is training election activists in the arts of collaborative leadership and planning. So these, as I said, are exercises in community organizing. There is a lot that people have to do around issues of coalition building, collaborative planning, figuring out how all voices can be heard in a planning process. So those are important skills, and students don't know them. Most people don't know them, actually. And so this is a great opportunity to teach them. In our document, we've got some links, for example, to organizations that do a great job with coalition building and have coalition building materials on their website. And finally, and I think most of you on this call know this, but I'm just going to say it to make sure you do, elections need to be fun. There needs to be a buzz on campus. Involvement in elections needs to be something we do around here. It's just got to be a little bit contagious. And so parades and art, doing art presentations or theater groups or anything that can make elections fun is a good idea. On one campus we visited, the polling places had been reduced from prior years. Sorry about the background noise. That it had been reduced from prior years from one polling machine from 4 polling machines to 1. And the campus anticipated very long lines. And so the students organized and got anybody who could do entertainment to come out and entertain people in these long lines. They did mime, they played music, they did dance moves, they made balloon animals, and it was celebratory and fun. And at the same time, all of the people encouraged each other, we know this line is long, let's stick to it because we can do this. That was an example of collaboration, leadership, planning, creating a buzz, and making elections fun. So with that, I'm going to turn to a couple of questions that we received when we did this on a webinar earlier today. And so one question was, well, what are the first steps we take? What are the first steps? So that's a good question. I think some of it I've already discussed. I think you take this report and share it broadly, that you hand it to key people on campus, like the president or the provost. I think it would be a very good idea to identify people who are already involved in not just the elections, but in political learning, in efforts to increase political discussions, in diversity and inclusion work, and in leadership training on campus. So when you build your coalitions, when you reach out to people, think more broadly than just who might be already interested in this work. Instead, think, who are those dots? Who's working on those dots on campus, and how can I help connect them? Another thing that I think would be very helpful is if you identified your experienced facilitators and got them the training materials for that. And we're not the only ones who train facilitators, and we're not the only ones who have really good approaches to doing that. So we've got materials linking to other organizations that can help you with that work. Some of them may be convenient to you physically, located in your city or state. So we recommend bringing them to campus if you can do that. I would work with the president to come up with a budget. I think a budget is really important, and you need coordinators here. You need people who can work on this stuff. You can't just take it out of people's free time. And I think that maybe answers that question about first steps. Now, another question we got though was, what happens if I'm on a campus where student activism gets squashed? I think that's an excellent question. And again, it's a really hard one because you are talking about a big component of your campus climate. Remember when I blew through Politics 365? Well, a big piece of a campus climate is what is the response to activism. So if you are at a campus where activism is not respected, it's not wanted, it is a problem, then you're going to have a tougher pathway, I think. Again, you can share our materials. We've got some writings on activism, but mostly I think you just have to link it back to the institution's civic mission. We can't be saying that we are in favor of civic engagement, but then pick and choose the engagement we want. And so I think that's a compelling thing to remind institutional leaders about. Now, activism that disrupts the learning process, that prevents learning for other people, that creates safety issues, yes, I think that you're going to be met with some resistance for those kinds of things. Activism that is on behalf of certain segments of the population that really don't want democratic principles and practices, I might recommend you say, I don't think we want that kind of activism here. An example of that was the Unite the Right parade at the University of Virginia. That was activism that may not be conducive to the other things that we're recommending in this report. So the tricky part there is, how do we make those decisions? Where do we draw the lines? How do we preserve free speech but also be inclusive? And again, we recommend discussion, dialogue about it. We've got a discussion guide on our website, and we recommend using it and having those conversations before the tough case comes along. So let's see, another question that we got was, how do we handle things? How do we handle things that aren't partisan, but that are looking partisan? And the example there was actually voting. So if you are in a state that is actively trying to deprive young people, students, or other demographic groups of their right to vote, you can take that on, and it's not partisan. And why do I say it's not partisan? Because it's an issue. It is almost like saying we can't advocate for interventions to prevent more global warming because that's partisan. That is, issue work is not partisan. Now, what you can't do is say, vote for this person because they support that issue or that side of an argument. You can't do that. But there is no rule out there that says that voting is partisan. I know lots of Democrats and lots of Republicans who want Americans to vote. So what you are fighting against are undemocratic practices and undemocratic laws. I don't think anybody should be nonpartisan about democracy. I think everybody is for it. So I would make the case that you can argue for additional voting rights. It is not a partisan issue. I think that there was one more question, and it was about how to approach professors who are resistant to making time to discuss voting in class, or they think it's beyond their discipline. My answer to that is that there is not one discipline, and I defy anybody to send it to me. Believe it or not, there are 8,000 fields of study among American colleges and universities. And I don't think there is one of those that does not have a public relevance, that is not relevant to public life. So engineering, for example, the engineers make bridges. Bridges affect communities. This is very relevant. You could also take a look at who's represented in Congress, for example. There are so few engineers and scientists in Congress. There are also too few women in Congress and people of color in Congress. So I think it's really important to take a look at that, but it is everybody's business how our society functions, and every single discipline has a public relevance. So I would make that case to faculty. Now, that isn't quite the same as discussing voting. And there, I think you have to respect faculty academic freedom. You know, they have the right to control their classes. I think that if you revert back to the nudging, if you're asking them for 20 seconds, every day for 2 weeks, that might be more agreeable than coming into class and taking 20 minutes of class time. So those are the trade-offs. I think that you could also work with the provosts, the department chairs, and the deans to help them understand how important this is. And as I said, bring us in if you get stuck. So that's it for me. I just want to tell you a little bit about the Civic Learning and Democratic Engagement Action Network and other partners in this. Out of the Crucible Moment report, there was a slide that flashed that picture, which came out in 2012. A number of organizations to the left side of this page got together and said, collectively, we are going to promote civic learning and democratic engagement in higher education. And there was a meeting of that group in June. And at that June meeting, they asked me, what are we going to do about voting? And I said, well, I don't know what we're going to do about voting exactly, but I think we should be connecting it with political learning and inclusion and student leadership agency and activism, etc. And they said, we're in. And so these are the organizations that have been promoting the election imperatives document. And then in addition to those, there are some others that have been putting it out, such as the Council for Independent Colleges, which represents private institutions, APSA, the Political Science Association, Project Pericles, etc. So this list is growing, and we are going to keep a running list on our website. And so this might be another compelling way to make the case on your campuses. These recommendations and election imperatives have been endorsed by these organizations. And then, as I said, we've got lots and lots of resources. If you get stuck wading through them, let us know. This is how you reach us. I'm Nancy Thomas. I'm the director of the Institute for Democracy in Higher Education, and I can be reached at this email, idhe@tufts.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter. We've got a newsletter that we put together, and we put out resources through that newsletter. So go to the Contact Us page and make sure you're signed up for that newsletter so that when we get really cool toys that you all are going to send us for sharing, we have a way of communicating them back to you. Thank you again for all of your time and interest in this, and good luck with your work. I look forward to hearing how it goes.